My parents abandoned me at Grandpa's house when I was 5, and for years I convinced myself they would eventually come back for me. They didn't. Grandpa became my entire world. He taught me how to read, how to work, and most importantly, how to never beg someone to love me. Every night before bed, he would tell me, "You were never abandoned because you weren't good enough. They left because they weren't strong enough to be parents." I didn't fully understand those words as a child, but I never forgot them. Years passed, and Grandpa raised me with more love than I ever thought possible. Then shortly after my 21st birthday, he became seriously ill. One evening, he called me into his study and handed me a small brass key. "When my time comes," he said quietly, "your parents will return. When they do, don't let them take anything until you follow my final instruction." I asked what he meant, but he only smiled. "You'll understand when the door opens." A few weeks later, Grandpa passed away peacefully in his sleep. I was devastated. I spent the entire morning beside him, refusing to believe that the man who had raised me was really gone. But before the funeral arrangements were even finished, my parents suddenly appeared. Mom walked through the front door as if she still owned the place. Dad barely looked at me. My sister followed behind them, already examining Grandpa's furniture and paintings. Mom pointed toward my bedroom and said coldly, "Pack your things, you're coming home with us." I stared at her in disbelief. "Home?" I asked. "You abandoned me here when I was 5. She rolled her eyes. "That was a long time ago." My sister was already opening drawers and choosing Grandpa's valuables. I remembered the brass key in my pocket and Grandpa's final instruction. "Nobody touches anything until I follow Grandpa's instructions," I said. Dad laughed. "You're still that stubborn little girl." Then I walked toward Grandpa's study. I inserted the brass key into the old lock. Nothing happened at first. Then I heard a deep click from inside the door. The lock released by itself. The door slowly opened, revealing a room none of us had ever been allowed to enter. My mother suddenly stopped breathing. My father went completely pale. My sister whispered, "What is that?" I stepped inside and saw a desk, several locked boxes, stacks of documents, and a large photograph of me as a 5-year-old. Beneath it was a handwritten message from Grandpa. "If they have returned, they are here for what they believe belongs to them. Open the first box before you let them leave." I walked toward the desk and picked up the first box. My hands were shaking as I inserted the brass key into the tiny lock. Behind me, nobody spoke. The silence was so heavy that I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. The box opened with a soft click. Inside were bank statements, property documents, old photographs, and a sealed envelope with my name written across it. I picked up the envelope first, but Dad suddenly stepped forward. "Give me that." I turned around. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because it belongs to your grandfather." I looked at him and replied, "Then why are you afraid of me opening it?" He said nothing. I opened the envelope. Grandpa's handwriting filled the first page. "If your parents are standing beside you when you read this, then they have come back for the inheritance." My mother immediately interrupted. "That's ridiculous." I continued reading. Grandpa explained that he had known for years that my parents weren't interested in me, they were interested in what he owned. He had deliberately kept his financial affairs private because he suspected they were waiting for him to die. Then I found something that made my heart stop. Grandpa had documented every payment he had made to my parents after they abandoned me. The records showed that he had financially supported them for years, even while they told relatives they were struggling. But there was more. He had also discovered that Dad had secretly borrowed money against one of Grandpa's properties without permission. I looked at my father. "You used Grandpa's property as collateral?" Dad immediately denied it. "That's not true." I pulled out the signed loan agreement. His signature was clearly visible. My sister looked at him in shock. "Dad, what did you do?" He became angry. "You don't understand." I replied, "I understand perfectly. You abandoned me, took money from Grandpa, and now you've come back for whatever is left." Mom stepped forward and demanded to know what Grandpa had left me. I ignored her and continued reading. The next page contained a list of properties. There were far more than I had ever known about. Grandpa owned several commercial buildings, a large piece of farmland, and a beautiful house near the coast. But beside each property was the same note, "Not for my children, reserved for my granddaughter." My mother suddenly grabbed the paper from my hand. Her face changed as she read the list. "This can't be right." I took it back. "Apparently it is." Then my sister noticed a second envelope beneath the documents. She picked it up and saw Dad's name on it. "This one is for you." Dad opened it slowly. His face became pale as he read the first few lines. Then he looked at me and whispered, "Your grandfather knew what I did before he died." Dad stood completely still, holding Grandpa's letter with both hands. Mom tried to look over his shoulder, but he quickly folded it. "What does it say?" she demanded. Dad didn't answer. I stepped closer and said, "Read it aloud." He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, fear. Finally, he began reading. Grandpa had written that years earlier he had discovered Dad secretly taking money from one of his businesses. Instead of exposing him immediately, Grandpa gave him a chance to repay everything. Dad promised he would, but he never did. Instead, he convinced Mom that once Grandpa died, they could take control of the estate and recover everything they believed they were owed. Grandpa had apparently known about that plan for years. He had hired an attorney and placed every major asset into a protected trust. I was the sole beneficiary. Dad stopped reading. I asked, "What else?" He shook his head. "Nothing." I reached for the letter. "Then I'll read it myself." The final paragraph explained why Grandpa had raised me instead of allowing my parents to take me back. He wrote that my parents had once planned to leave the country after selling several family assets, and they intended to take me only because they believed having their daughter with them would make their story look respectable. Grandpa had refused to let them use me that way. He had legally taken responsibility for me and spent the rest of his life protecting my future. My mother suddenly started crying. "We made mistakes." I looked at her. "You abandoned a 5-year-old child." She wiped her tears and said, "We thought we'd come back." I answered, "You didn't come back for 20 years. My sister looked between us, visibly shaken. "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" Mom turned toward her. "You were young." My sister shook her head. "So you lied to me too?" Nobody answered. I opened the second box and discovered something even more shocking. Photographs, letters, and recordings documenting every visit my parents had made to Grandpa over the years. They never came to ask about me. Every conversation was about money, properties, or the inheritance. One recording captured Mom saying, "Once the old man is gone, she'll have no choice but to come with us." My sister covered her mouth. "That's why you came today." I nodded. "Exactly." Then I noticed a final document at the bottom of the box. It was Grandpa's official estate plan, signed and witnessed. I read the first line and felt my heart stop. It said, "My granddaughter receives everything, but only after she completes one final task." I stared at the final sentence of Grandpa's estate plan, wondering what kind of task he could possibly have left me. My mother immediately demanded, "What task?" I folded the document and said, "You'll find out when I do." Dad stepped forward, but my sister stopped him. "Let her read it." I turned the page and discovered that Grandpa had left detailed instructions for the estate attorney. The first requirement was simple. Before I could receive the properties, I had to spend one night alone in the old cottage where he had raised me. The second requirement was more surprising. I had to open a hidden safe and deliver its contents to someone named Daniel Reed. I had no idea who Daniel Reed was. Then I saw the final instruction. "Do not trust anyone who tries to stop you." My parents immediately began protesting. Dad insisted the instructions were probably written while Grandpa was confused. Mom said I should simply sign the inheritance papers and let the lawyers handle everything. But my sister looked at me and said, "You should do exactly what Grandpa asked." That night, I drove to the old cottage alone. The house was dark and silent, but everything looked exactly as I remembered it. I entered the study and found the hidden safe behind a bookshelf. The combination was written inside Grandpa's old watch. When I opened it, I found a small flash drive, several photographs, and another envelope. The envelope contained a letter addressed to Daniel Reed. I called the number written beneath his name. An older man answered. When I told him who I was, he became silent. Then he asked, "Did your grandfather finally tell you?" I asked, "Tell me what?" He replied, "Why your parents left you." My heart started pounding. Daniel explained that he had been Grandpa's attorney for more than 30 years. He had witnessed the night my parents abandoned me, and Grandpa had asked him to keep certain evidence until I was old enough to understand it. He told me that my parents hadn't simply left because they didn't want the responsibility of raising me. There had been a specific reason. Grandpa had discovered that my father was involved in a serious financial scheme, and my parents were afraid that if investigators questioned them, I would be taken away too. They believed abandoning me with Grandpa would keep me out of the investigation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So they left me to protect themselves?" I asked. Daniel answered quietly, "Yes." But that's not the worst part. He told me to open the flash drive immediately. I connected it to my laptop. A single video file appeared on the screen. The recording was dated the exact day my parents left me at Grandpa's house. I pressed play. My father's voice filled the room. Then I heard my mother say something that made my entire body go cold. "If she stays with Dad, she'll never know what we did." I replayed the recording 3 times because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother's voice was unmistakable. She was talking to Grandpa on the night they left me. "If she stays with you, she'll never know what we did," Mom said. Dad replied, "She doesn't need to know. By the time she's old enough to understand, we'll be gone." Grandpa's voice was calm but furious. "You are abandoning your 5-year-old daughter to protect yourselves." Dad answered, "We're giving her a better chance with you." Then Mom said something that broke my heart. "She'll forget us eventually." I paused the recording and sat there crying. For 20 years, I had wondered whether I had done something wrong. Now I knew the truth. They hadn't left because I wasn't worth loving. They left because they were afraid of what they had done. Daniel called again. "Now you understand why your grandfather protected that recording." I asked him what my parents had done. He explained that Dad had been involved in a scheme to secretly transfer company funds into accounts controlled by him and Mom. Grandpa discovered the fraud and threatened to report it. My parents panicked and decided to disappear. Grandpa intervened and made sure I stayed with him while he dealt with the legal consequences. But there was another detail Grandpa had never told me. The money my parents stole hadn't disappeared. Grandpa had recovered most of it and placed it into the trust that eventually became my inheritance. Daniel told me that the trust was not simply an inheritance, it was evidence of how much Grandpa had sacrificed to protect me. I asked him why Grandpa never told me any of this while he was alive. Daniel answered, "Because he wanted you to remember him as your grandfather, not as the man who spent his life fighting your parents." I cried harder. Grandpa had carried the truth alone so I could have a normal childhood. The next morning I returned to the main house. My parents were waiting for me. Mom immediately asked, "Did you find anything?" I looked at both of them and said, "Yes." Dad's expression changed. "What did you find?" I placed the flash drive on the table. "The recording from the night you abandoned me." Mom's face went completely white. Dad sat down slowly. My sister looked at them in confusion. "What recording?" I pressed play. Their own voices filled the room. My sister covered her mouth as she listened. When the recording ended, nobody spoke. Finally, I looked at my parents and said, "You didn't abandon me because you couldn't take care of me. You abandoned me because you were afraid I'd discover who you really were." Dad lowered his head. Mom began crying. Then my sister asked the question none of us expected. "What did you steal from Grandpa?" Dad looked at her and whispered, "Everything we could." My sister stared at Dad in disbelief. "Everything," she repeated. Dad looked down at the floor. "We took money from his businesses, transferred properties, and tried to hide the evidence." Mom interrupted. "We were desperate." I shook my head. "You weren't desperate when you left me. You were protecting yourselves." Dad finally admitted that Grandpa had discovered the entire scheme and had given them one chance to confess. Instead, they chose to disappear and leave me behind. My sister began crying. "And you let me believe she was the problem?" Mom couldn't answer. I handed the evidence to Daniel, who had already contacted the authorities. The investigation reopened immediately, and the documents Grandpa had preserved proved that my parents had been responsible for years of financial fraud. But Grandpa had prepared for one final possibility. His trust contained not only the properties and investments, but also the original ownership records showing that everything my parents had taken was legally recoverable. Within months, the stolen assets were returned to the estate. My parents were forced to sell the properties they had acquired illegally and repay what they could. My sister chose to separate herself completely from their financial affairs. One evening, she came to me and said, "I spent my whole life believing they chose me over you." I replied, "They didn't choose either of us. They chose themselves." She hugged me and cried. For the first time, I felt like I had a sister instead of someone standing on the other side of my parents' lies. I eventually received the inheritance Grandpa had protected for me, but the money wasn't what mattered most. The most valuable thing he had left me was the truth. I understood why he had raised me, why he had protected me, and why he had never allowed my parents to control my future. Before Daniel left, he handed me one final envelope. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this only after everything was settled." I opened it and read the first line. "Now that you know why they left, you must decide what you will do with the life they gave away." I looked at my sister and smiled through my tears. I finally knew the answer. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life punishing my parents. I was going to build the life Grandpa had always wanted for me, and for the first time, I understood that their abandonment hadn't been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of the life Grandpa fought so hard to give me. A year later, everything had changed. My parents were no longer living in Grandpa's house, and the properties they had tried to claim had been returned to the trust. My father eventually accepted responsibility for the financial scheme, while my mother stopped trying to convince everyone that she had acted out of love. My sister and I, however, became closer than we had ever been. We spent months sorting through Grandpa's remaining belongings, and every box seemed to contain another piece of the life he had quietly built for me. One afternoon, my sister found an old photograph of the three of us from when we were children. She looked at it for a long time before saying, "I wish things had been different." I smiled sadly. "So do I then," she asked. "Do you ever wish you had gone with them?" I thought about the question. 20 years ago, I might have said yes. Now I shook my head. No. Because if I had gone, I would never have known Grandpa the way I did. She nodded. He really saved you, I corrected her gently. He didn't just save me, he gave me a life. We decided to use part of the inheritance to create a scholarship in Grandpa's name for children whose families couldn't afford their education. It became the most meaningful thing I had ever done. At the opening ceremony, I stood in front of dozens of students and looked at the plaque bearing Grandpa's name. Beneath it were the words he had written in his final letter. Never let the circumstances of your childhood decide the limits of your future. I finally understood why he had waited until after his death to reveal the truth. He didn't want revenge. He wanted me to know that I had been loved every single day, even when the people who should have loved me chose to leave. My parents had spent years believing they had abandoned me. In reality, they had abandoned themselves. Grandpa had given me something far more valuable than money, property, or an inheritance. He had given me the confidence to build a future without needing anyone's permission. Years later, I returned to the old cottage where he had raised me. I sat beside the fireplace, opened his final letter, and read the last sentence again. If you ever wonder whether you were worth staying for, remember that I stayed. I closed my eyes and smiled. For most of my life, I had carried the pain of being abandoned. Now I carried something stronger, the knowledge that someone had chosen me, and that changed everything. My parents may have walked away when I was 5, but Grandpa stayed until his final breath. They gave me a childhood full of unanswered questions. He gave me a lifetime of answers.